Ida for telling the truth about why I ended my engagement to my ex's parents and grandparents. I had spent over a year planning a future with a man I thought I knew, only to watch it all unravel in the most devastating way. The engagement, the dreams, the whispered promises of forever shattered. I called it off in October, and while my own family and friends knew, many in my ex's circle remained in the dark. It wasn't my responsibility to explain, and yet, the fallout rippled through his family like a storm no one could contain. His parents, already burdened with the weight of their own family's chaos, grew weary of the whispers, the tension, the unspoken grief that seemed to have settled like a permanent fog over their lives. His grandparents, too, watched in confusion as the family fractured in ways they didn't understand. They had always been kind to me, welcoming, treating me like one of their own, and when they finally approached me tired, exasperated, desperate for clarity, they asked the question that had been hanging in the air for months. Why had I called everything off? I could have deflected. I could have told them it was personal, that some things didn't need to be rehashed, that the past was better left buried. But I had spent too much time being silent, too much time questioning my own instincts, too much time playing the fool in a situation where I should have been protecting myself. And so, I told them. Not because I wanted to stir the pot, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because the truth had been a weight on my chest for too long, and I needed to let it go. I should have seen the disaster coming from the beginning. I should have questioned the absurdity of it all, but I didn't. I wanted to be supportive, to be understanding, to believe that my ex and I were strong enough to navigate even the strangest of circumstances. His brother and his wife had struggled for so long to have a baby, their heartbreak a constant presence in the family. It was only natural, I supposed, that when my ex was approached with an unusual request, he considered it. He was, after all, his brother's flesh and blood, and in their minds, if a biological link could be preserved, then perhaps it was the next best thing. They wanted my ex to donate his sperm. It was an odd proposition, but not unheard of. They weren't going through official channels, no clinics, no doctors, just a do-it-yourself approach, the so-called turkey baster method, an arrangement that seemed clinical, detached, emotionless. They assured us they would be honest with the child one day, that the child would know the truth about their biological connection, that it wouldn't change anything about the way the family functioned. And I, naive, trusting, wanting to be a good partner, agreed to it. I helped. I facilitated it. I was the one handing my fiancé's biological material over to his brothers so he could take it home to his wife, all under the assumption that this was nothing more than a means to an end. It should have been simple. But it never is it? At first, things seemed fine. It took several attempts, but eventually, she got pregnant. That should have been a time of joy, of relief, of celebration. But that was when everything changed. She changed. At first, it was subtle. A glare that lingered a little too long. A sharpness in her tone that hadn't been there before. Snide remarks that cut deeper than they should have. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was hormones, that pregnancy was an emotional whirlwind, that she was overwhelmed and stressed and not thinking clearly. But then I started noticing the way she looked at me, the way her eyes darkened whenever I was with my ex, the way her lips curled in barely concealed disdain when I spoke. The jealousy was palpable. And for the life of me, I couldn't understand why. It all came to a head one day when I was alone at home. She showed up, uninvited, her presence filling the space with a suffocating tension. And then she accused me of trying to drive a wedge between the brothers, of wanting her child to grow up without a sibling, of somehow manipulating the situation for my own benefit. The words hit like a slap, their absurdity almost laughable if not for the venom behind them. And yet, there was something more beneath her anger, something unspoken, something deeper. I looked her in the eye and asked the only question that made sense. Why are you acting like a jealous girlfriend? The reaction was instantaneous. Her face twisted with rage, Her body trembled with fury, and she screamed at me to back off. To leave her alone. To stay out of it. And in that moment, clarity struck like lightning. She wasn't just jealous. She was hiding something. I confronted my ex that night, demanding an explanation. But he played dumb. He had no idea why she was behaving that way. No idea why she was acting territorial. No idea why his brother's wife was treating me like a rival. But I knew. And then, as if fate needed to drive the knife in even deeper, his brother came to me. He asked if I had noticed his wife acting strangely with my ex. That was all the confirmation I needed. I said yes. And so, together, we confronted them. It should have been a simple answer, a clear-cut explanation. But instead, we got deflection, evasion, and then, finally, the gut-wrenching truth. It hadn't been the turkey baster method. It hadn't been as simple as we had all been led to believe. My ex had slept with her. The betrayal settled over me like a cold, suffocating weight. My ex, scrambling, desperate, insisted that it wasn't like that. That it was just about the baby. That it didn't mean anything. That it was just a technicality. That it was in and out. That it shouldn't matter, because the goal had been achieved. I couldn't listen to another word. I walked away from him that night, slipped the engagement ring off my finger, and placed it in his hand. There was no yelling, no screaming, no dramatic goodbye. Just the sound of my own heart breaking as I turned and left. He begged for forgiveness, pleaded for me to reconsider, but how could I? How could I ever look at him the same way again? I wasn't just betrayed. I had been made complicit in my own humiliation. I had been an unwitting participant in the biggest lie of my life. And so, I disappeared from their world. I didn't care what happened next. I didn't care if his brother forgave him, if she found a way to justify her actions, if they all lived in a mess of their own making. But when his parents and grandparents came to me, asking for the truth, I told them. And a few days later, my ex reached out one last time. Not to apologize. Not to make amends. But to ask why I had to go and mess with his family like that. As if he hadn't already done it himself. As if I was the villain in the story he had written. I blocked him. And for the first time in a long time, I let go of the weight that wasn't mine to carry. The whole thing had started out as an act of goodwill, a way to help a struggling couple finally get what they wanted after years of heartbreak. My ex and I were engaged, preparing to build a future together, and when his brother and sister-in-law came to us with their desperate request, it hadn't seemed like something that would turn my world inside out. It was unconventional, sure, but I had no reason to believe that anything beyond science and biology was at play. My ex agreed to donate, I supported him in the decision, and we moved forward with what should have been a cut-and-dry arrangement. They wanted to conceive using the so-called turkey baster method, avoiding clinics or official medical procedures, wanting to keep things private but still making sure the child would know the truth one day. It was their choice, and I had no issue with it. At first, it had been awkward but manageable. My ex would provide the sample, I would be the one helping him collect it, and his brother would pick it up and take it home to his wife. It was clinical, methodical, and lacked any emotional weight, at least, that's what I thought. It took several tries, more than I expected, and I'll admit, there were moments where I wondered if this was a sign that we were forcing something unnatural. But then it worked. His sister-in-law was pregnant. It should have been a moment of joy, relief, celebration. And that's when things began to shift. The change in her was almost imperceptible at first, a lingering glance that lasted too long, a forced smile that never reached her eyes, a stiffness in her posture whenever I was around. I chalked it up to hormones, to stress, to the natural adjustments that came with pregnancy. I tried not to overthink it, dismissing the unease that curled in the pit of my stomach. But as the weeks passed, her behavior became impossible to ignore. She was jealous. Not just irritated, not just moody, but actively hostile. She would make snide comments when we were all together, sharp little digs hidden behind a laugh, passive-aggressive remarks that I wasn't sure I was even supposed to catch. But I did. And then there were the looks. God, the looks. She would glare at me, her eyes brimming with something dark and unspoken, something possessive, something territorial. And the worst part? My ex noticed none of it. Or at least, he pretended not to. I tried to brush it off, but it was getting harder and harder to ignore. The tension was thick, hanging over every interaction like a storm cloud ready to break open. When my ex and I were invited over to see the ultrasound pictures, I thought maybe this would be a turning point. Maybe this was the moment where things would settle, where the weirdness would dissolve, and we could all just be happy for what was happening. But the second my ex put his arm around me, smiling down at the images of the tiny life growing inside her, I saw it, her expression twisted into something ugly. A clenched jaw, a tightening around her eyes, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She wasn't looking at the scan. She was looking at him. At us. And she was furious. I barely had time to process it before things escalated even further. A few days later, she showed up at my home unannounced. I opened the door, startled to see her standing there, her face drawn tight with something unreadable. Before I could even ask why she was there, she pushed past me, stepping into my space as if she had every right to be there. The air between us was charged, thick with something dangerous, and I knew that whatever was about to be said was going to change everything. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She accused me. Accused me of trying to come between the brothers, of creating some invisible rift, of wanting her child to grow up without a sibling, of plotting to keep my ex away from her new family unit. The accusations were wild, baseless, dripping with a level of paranoia that made my skin crawl. My mind reeled, trying to keep up, trying to understand where any of this was coming from. And then it hit me. It wasn't about me. It was about him. The way she was looking at me, the way she was speaking, the raw emotion laced into her words. It wasn't the anger of a woman protecting her marriage. It wasn't the concern of a mother-to-be ensuring the stability of her child's future. It was jealousy. It was possessiveness. It was the kind of reaction you would expect from a girlfriend, a lover, someone who saw me as a rival rather than a bystander in all of this. And that was when I said it. I looked her dead in the eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, and I asked her point blank, "Why are you acting like a jealous girlfriend?" The reaction was instantaneous. Her face twisted, her breathing hitched, and for a fraction of a second, something flashed across her features. Guilt. Panic. Fear. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by white-hot fury. She lost it. She screamed at me to back off, her voice shrill and shaking, her hands trembling as she pointed a finger at me like she wished she could strike me down where I stood. I should have been afraid. Maybe I was. But more than anything, I was shaken. Because in that moment, I knew. I knew I had stumbled onto the truth. I knew that whatever had happened, whatever they weren't telling me, it was far worse than I had ever imagined. And I knew that the life I had been building, the engagement I had believed in, the relationship I had trusted in, had all been a lie. I didn't say another word. I let her storm out, slamming the door behind her. But as I stood there, my hands still shaking, my mind racing, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape, one thought consumed me. I needed answers. And I wasn't sure I was ready to hear them. I should have been prepared for the lies. I should have known he would try to weasel his way out, feigning innocence, playing the role of the confused, loyal fiancé caught in the middle of some bizarre misunderstanding. But after what had just happened with her, after her fury, her accusations, the way she had looked at me as if I were the other woman, I knew there was no misunderstanding. There was only deception, only betrayal, only the slow, agonizing realization that I had been made a fool of in the worst possible way. I confronted him that night. I was shaking, but my voice was steady. I told him what she had said, how she had shown up at my home, how she had accused me of tearing his family apart, how she had acted like I was some kind of threat to her relationship with him. And he had the audacity to play dumb. What? That's crazy, he said, his brow furrowing like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he had never seen before. I have no idea why she would say something like that. It was so rehearsed, so polished, so perfectly casual that I almost second-guessed myself. Almost. I asked him outright, had something happened between them? Was there any reason, any possible reason, that she would be acting this way? I needed him to slip up, to show his hand, to give me even the smallest confirmation of what I already knew in my gut. He sighed, rubbed his face, shook his head like this whole thing was exhausting for him. Babe, come on. It's nothing. She's probably just hormonal. You know how pregnancy is, it messes with emotions. Maybe she feels weird about how it happened. Maybe she's lashing out because it took so long to work and she's got all these built-up feelings about it. But there's nothing going on. Nothing happened. But I saw it, the flicker of something in his expression. The avoidance. The way he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he said the words. He was lying. I didn't push further that night. I let it sit. I let him believe he had convinced me, let him think I had swallowed his excuses, let him exhale in relief when I finally let the conversation drop. Because I needed more than just my suspicions, I needed confirmation. And I got it sooner than I expected. His brother came to me the very next day. It was the first time I had seen him since she had shown up at my door, and the moment he looked at me, I knew something was wrong. He looked exhausted, his face drawn tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. There was a tension in his posture, a barely contained rage simmering just beneath the surface. He didn't dance around it. He didn't ease into the conversation. He went straight for the kill. Have you noticed my wife acting weird around my brother? The question was blunt. Direct. A loaded weapon, and we both knew it. I didn't hesitate. Yep. And just like that, the fragile illusion they had tried to build cracked and shattered around us. We confronted them together that night. I wish I could say there was some grand reveal, some dramatic confession that laid everything bare. But it wasn't like that. It was a mess. A screaming match. A disaster unfolding in real time. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she looked at both of us, her husband, the man she had spent years with, and me, the woman she had treated like a rival, and rolled her eyes like we were the ones being ridiculous. Why does it even matter how it happened? She snapped. We got what we wanted, didn't we? Her words landed like a slap. Her husband, my ex's brother, went deathly still. I felt my breath catch in my throat. She wasn't even trying to justify it. She wasn't trying to lie, or twist the truth, or paint herself as a victim. She genuinely believed it didn't matter. My ex, on the other hand, was scrambling. It's not like that, he said quickly, his voice rising, his eyes darting between the three of us like he was searching for a way out. The turkey baster thing wasn't working. That's all. It's not. Not what? His brother cut in, his voice eerily calm. My ex swallowed hard. It was just technical. It wasn't a big deal. It was just in and out. It didn't mean anything. And that's when his brother lost it. I don't think I had ever seen a man go from deathly still to pure, unfiltered rage in a single breath. 1 second, he was standing there, silent, processing. The next, he was moving. I barely had time to react before he lunged at my ex, his fist connecting with his jaw so hard I heard the sickening crack of bone against bone. My ex stumbled back, clutching his face, shouting something incoherent, but his brother wasn't finished. He was seeing red, consumed by fury, by betrayal, by the realization that the people he had trusted the most had shattered his world in a way that could never be repaired. It took everything in me to step between them, to stop it from escalating further, but it was already too late. The damage was done. I looked at my ex, this man I had once planned to spend my life with, this man I had loved, this man I had trusted. And all I felt was disgust. He turned to me, eyes wild, desperate, pleading. "Babe, please. You have to believe me. It wasn't like that." I pulled the ring off my finger and placed it in his hand. His face crumpled. "No. Don't do this. Please, we can fix this." But there was nothing to fix. I turned and walked away, leaving him in the wreckage of the life he had destroyed. I didn't look back. And I never would. I walked away that night without looking back, but the aftershocks of the truth I had unearthed rippled outward, tearing through their family like a fault line finally giving way. The chaos I had left behind was no longer my burden to carry, yet I knew it would consume them in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. I didn't know what happened to his brother, to her, to the fragile remnants of a marriage now built on nothing but betrayal and deception. I had severed all ties, erased their presence from my life, and for the first time in over a year, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of their lies suffocating me. But the universe has a way of making sure unfinished business never truly stays buried. Days passed. Then weeks. And though I had moved forward, returning to my own life, my own plans, the past refused to stay in the past. It wasn't until his parents and grandparents reached out that I realized just how deeply the fractures had spread. They wanted answers. I could hear it in their voices, see it in the hesitant way they approached me, the unspoken grief hanging between us like a storm cloud. They had pieced together bits of the wreckage, enough to know that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. But they didn't know why. They didn't understand how everything had collapsed so suddenly. And for a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't my story to tell. Not anymore. I had walked away from it, left them to sort through the ruins on their own. But when I looked at them, when I saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the sheer desperation for clarity, I realized that my silence would only serve the people who had already caused enough damage. So, I told them. Everything. I told them about the arrangement, about how I had supported it, about how I had stood by, trusting, believing, foolishly thinking that we were all on the same side. I told them about the shift, the way she had turned on me, the jealousy, the rage, the accusations that had come out of nowhere but, in hindsight, had been warning signs I had ignored. I told them about the confrontation, about the way she had practically admitted it without remorse, as if the betrayal meant nothing as long as they got the result they wanted. I told them how my ex had stood there, scrambling for excuses, spewing out justifications that made it clear he had no real regrets, just regret that he had been caught. I told them how I had given the ring back, how I had walked away, how I had chosen to save myself from a lifetime of lies. They listened in silence, their faces shifting from confusion to horror, from disbelief to resignation. I think, deep down, they already knew. Maybe not the details, not the extent of it, but they had felt the cracks long before I ever confirmed it. When I finished, they thanked me. And then they apologized. For asking. For bringing it up. For making me relieve it. And I thought that was the end of it. But a few days later, I received a message. It was from an account I didn't recognize at first, one of those forgotten profiles that linger in the background of social media. And the moment I saw his name, my stomach twisted in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. My ex. His words hit the screen like venom. Why did you have to mess with my family like that? You already walked away. You didn't have to ruin everything for everyone else. And then the worst part. The part that made my blood run cold. You fucked my brother over more than I already had. It was an admission wrapped in blame, a confession laced with resentment. There was no apology, no remorse, no attempt to make things right. Just anger. Just frustration that his actions had consequences, that the truth had caught up to him in ways he couldn't escape. I stared at the message, feeling nothing. Not sadness. Not rage. Just exhaustion. And then I blocked him. For good this time. But long after I closed the app, his words lingered. I had ruined his family? No. He had. I had exposed his betrayal? No. He had done that all on his own. I had hurt his brother? No. The real pain had come from the people who had made choices without thinking about the fallout, the people who had let selfishness drive their actions, the people who had destroyed something that could never be repaired. Still, the guilt gnawed at me. Had I overstepped? Had I told the truth before his brother was ready? Had I made things worse for him in my attempt to free myself from the weight of it all? Maybe. But then I remembered the look in his brother's eyes the night the truth came out. The rage, the betrayal, the sheer devastation of realizing that the people closest to him had shattered his trust beyond recognition. I hadn't been the one to destroy his world. I had only been the one who refused to let them keep pretending it wasn't already in ruins. And for that, I would never apologize.